Hi, this is Bob from Hobby Concepts back with part 2 of my Globe Liner build. Actually, this is going to be part 2 and 3. I had so much video I couldn't render it into one part, so I'm going to divide them into parts 2 and 3, and I'll post them both at the same time. So after you watch part 2, you should be able to go right to part 3. Before I start, I just want to say thank you. I got an email from YouTube that said I passed 10,000 subscribers. I am humbled and I'm amazed, and thank you so much for watching, everybody. This is it's been really kind of fun. So this Globe Liner is an awesome kit. As you can see, I've got the basic Globe Liner done. That's what we're going to do in these next couple of videos, so let's get started. Okay, well, in part 1 of my Globe Liner build, we got the chassis done. So now it's time to do actually a lot of the fun stuff. Detailing, mud flaps, couplers, the body, and get it running. So that's going to be a lot of fun. First step is the mud flaps. I've got the pieces here, but I just want to show one of the things I really like is this little plastic wrench tool that they give you. It's on the tree with the coupler parts. And it holds the nuts, so those little tiny 2mm nuts, which my fat fingers don't do real well, so you can get them started. And the mud flaps just mount through here. And now I've got the nut driver. I'm going to actually put Loctite on it, but I really just want to show off the nut driver, so I'm going to put these mud flaps together. The coupler is pretty straightforward. It has a lot of small parts. The first part is a capture nut that mounts in the hook, and nothing exciting there. Pretty straightforward. And then this screw mounts up in the plate. This drops over it with this bushing. So we'll get this put together. And then once this plate is put together, it just drops into the coupler assembly. Like that, and this screws on with 3 bolts. So I'm going to put that together. That works like this. The only thing I've ever done is sometimes it's easy to get this cocked when you bolt the plate down, and it hangs up here. So make sure that this is moving freely when you bolt this down. And then the spring, turn spring, just screws into these holes. Now this coupler is different on some of the trucks. The King Hauler and the Globe Liner, the King Hauler Black Edition, use this style coupler. The Grand Hauler uses a coupler that's different. It's flat on the front, it assembles differently, so make sure if you're building a different kit you check your instructions carefully. And once this is put together, may as well do it. This pivot plate mounts with the long side facing forward. Hinge pin just slides through. Now the coupler plate, you can see I painted, and I painted this truck with Tamiya TS58, which is a pearl light blue. And I like to paint the coupler plates once in a while. I did a little extra detail here with some silver and some black. This just mounts on top of here. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about painting when I do the body, but I did a separate painting video, which I'll link to in the description for this video. So I'm going to go ahead and mount this. So the coupler plate is all set. It mounts up on top here. The fenders mount at this stage. Here's a little trick I use to put these on, because you've got to use a nut on the back side, and it is really hard to get in there, especially on a globe liner. So I take the screw, and you can angle it through like this, put a little thread lock on it, and now you have lots of room to get the nut on there. Dropped it anyway. You only put it on a couple turns, then you can pull this out and get the pins in. And then tighten it up. Otherwise, it's just a nightmare to get that nut on. So we've got that, we've got our mud flaps, they just mount with a couple of screws, and our coupler plate. So we'll put some Loctite on all these. And use these little short 3mm screws to hold everything together. So I'll go ahead and get that finished up. Well, next up is to build a fuel tank. Here's the finished product with the steps. It's pretty easy. It's actually very easy. But here's something I always do. I've done this a million times. Screw them together and then realize that I've got these backwards. They both mount on the same side. So I've done that a lot, just saving you a little grief there. And now I want to talk about glue a little bit, because this is the first place in the kit where you're actually going to use some glue. Now, there's a couple different kinds of glue. The Tamiya cement, this is a Tamiya extra thin cement. This stuff is fantastic for gluing plastic. It works by actually melting the plastic together. So unpainted plastic, it glues them together really well. It does not work at all on chrome, because the chrome plating keeps the glue from dissolving the plastic. It doesn't work on 3D printed parts, that type of thing. So on the chrome parts and the clear parts, my very favorite is micro crystal clear, which you can get from Microscale. I'll put a link in the description. But Elmer's clear glue works pretty good too. And anything that's clear, like the amber turn signal lenses, the headlights, you want to use this type of cement. If you use this, it dissolves the plastic and it'll craze the colored plastic. So do not use this around anywhere around windows or anything. Always use this micro crystal clear, or maybe some Elmer's clear glue. I just spread it around a little bit on the inside of this and shove it on. And it's a tight fit on a globe liner. And that's all there is to it. The other thing nice about this glue is it bonds quite well, but you can actually take the parts apart later if you need to. Okay, the next thing, this little metal plate, screws onto the bottom. Again, I put the dimples down, and nothing exciting here. Well, I mounted that metal plate with the two screws, but here's the other thing I wanted to mention. This bracket mounts like this, and these little plastic things go over the top with a bolt through them. But here's another little build tip. This has a sprue mark on one side. So another, quality build tip, that goes in so that you have a nice smooth outside. So then this just bolts on. This one goes on here, 2 bolts through the bottom, 2 screws through the top, and then you'll have the tanks finished. Actually, installing the tank is simple. The only thing that's even remotely weird is there's 2 different length screws, because the bracket gets thicker as it goes back. So short screw goes in the front, long screw goes in the back, and now all of a sudden the chassis is starting to look pretty darn good. Starting to look like a truck, so I'll get that screwed on. Prepping the cab floor just involves mounting the battery strap, and the only complicated part there is this clip has a hole in it that you want to have sideways to the work. The seats mount from the bottom up. Now I've already, the seats are two pieces. I glued them together before painting. As I mentioned before, the Tamiya cement works best on unpainted parts. And then I airbrushed these with a little bit of NATO brown. Obviously you can do the interior any color you like. And the seats mount with a screw from the bottom up. Now I'm going to take the seats back off because in the next step I'm going to be flipping the truck over. I want to show you how to adjust it, the transmission, and hook up the wiring. So I'm not going to completely finish this part. I'm going to mount it on the truck with the screws loose, and it just, the wires just pull up through the center here. We have our two servo wires and our two motor wires. And then this just bolts down with 6 screws that are threaded into the chassis. Don't forget Loctite when you do that. I'm not going to Loctite this either because, again, I'm going to be taking it on and off. So I'll go ahead, take the seat off, mount this down, and we'll come back and talk about electronics, the very important part. I mounted this deck down just with 2 screws, and I did not use Loctite because I'm going to lift it back off later. The final piece to put down before the radio is this control arm for the coupler. And it just has a screw that goes through this bushing. You can see I mounted the ball joint in the arm. This assembly just goes together like this, and there's a place to capture the nut here. So that's pretty straightforward. And then there's a ball link that just snaps into place. This mounts right here, and the ball link snaps to the ball underneath this coupler, and then that operates the coupler. So I'm going to mount that down. We'll get going on the radio. The radio control unit consists of a transmitter and a receiver. And then to operate the truck, we need an electronic speed control, an ESC, as I mentioned. And the ESC plugs into the battery. And then it has a 5-volt regulator that powers the receiver. So you never want to power the receiver directly with a 7.2 volt battery. You'll burn it up. It must go through a receiver. And so those are the main components along with the servos. Now, a couple things I want to mention with the radio. First off, this is a 6-channel radio. So each of these sticks moves 2 ways. So that's the first 4 channels. And then the 2 additional channels can be assigned to whatever. And I assigned those to a 3-position switch and a 2-position switch. Now you could easily assign it to a knob or another switch. So here's this typical setup. This is steering, left and right. This is throttle forward and reverse, and that's why we need the centering stick, so it goes back to neutral when you let go. And the 3-position switch will be my shifting, low, medium, and high, to shift the 3-speed transmission. When you get the radio, most radios come with a protective film over the panel. And sometimes people don't notice this and they wonder why their panel's a little dull. Peel that off. And the other thing about this radio is it's a digital radio. It operates on 2.4 megahertz. Now in the good old days we used radios that had big antennas you had to extend. They were on 75 megahertz and they would interfere with each other. These types of radios are digitally encrypted to their receiver, so this will only talk to this receiver, and if you want to add a second receiver you have to bind it, they call it, to this transmitter so that they can talk to each other. So my transmitter's all operating. Let's plug in the receiver. So these are numbered 1 through 6. We're going to plug the speed control into channel 3. which is the third one up, negative out. You heard this beep. This has a feature where it actually talks to the receiver, and so I'm getting telemetry. Shows my receiver voltage. That back on the speed control. And we'll plug in my steering servo to channel 1. Okay, so you can hear that operate. So now we have steering. So I'm going to flip the truck over so you can see it better. And you should be able to see the steering go back and forth. Now the first thing I want to set up is straighten up the steering, and let me show you how to do that. Okay, straighten up the steering so the truck drives straight. It's a little bit crooked right now. It's this way. I'll lay a straight edge on it, just double check, and yes, it's crooked. So what I need to do is to get this straight when the radio's in the neutral position. To do that, I need to shorten this rod here, which will pull this in. So I will unsnap it, and then I will just tighten the ball joint to shorten it. And that looks a lot better. Okay, so now it's straight. I want to make sure it's operating in the right direction. So when I go right, it goes right, and I go left, it goes left. And it does. And I want to make sure I'm not overdriving the servo. Overdriving the servo means these steering arms would stop, and the servo still has a lot of movement in it, which puts a bind on things. So if I move this all the way, I can see we're just barely touching, and the servo is just fine. So that takes care of our steering. Now let's take a look at this shifting. Okay, the shift servo goes into channel 5, and as I mentioned, plugged it in backwards. Ground goes out. Okay, I mentioned that my switch here is the shifting. So we'll flip this back over, and you should be able to see this servo move to the 3 positions. So we'll start with it in the center position, and here's my shift rod. Now my shift rod just snaps onto this ball on the transmission. Okay, it's on the transmission, and you can see that we pull the transmission in and out to shift it. So now the springs inside the transmission are holding it in the center position. So I'll do the same thing as the steering and adjust it for length, and it is adjusted quite well right now. So I'll just snap it on. Low, medium, and high. Okay, so now it's time to power up the truck and see how our shifting works. So to do that, I'll take my speed control, and it has 2 plugs here that plug into the motor. Now, right now we don't really need to worry about whether it's going forward or backwards, but if the truck runs backwards, you can just change the 2 wires. So these just plug in, and they have a plastic covering to keep them from shorting out. Well, we hear it run. So we can flip this over, and we can see, hopefully you can see, the drive shaft working. And then reverse. So that's looking pretty good. So now shifting, we're in medium gear. There's low gear, medium gear, and high gear. And boy, it shifts fine. We're going to check the same thing about overdriving the servo. And that looks good. So that's how you set up the shifting and the steering. Truck looks good. That 55 turn motor I put in has really got a nice low speed, and everything looks good. So we're going to flip it back over here. I'll unplug the battery, turn the radio off. Now the speed control has an on-off switch, which I personally don't use. I just plug and unplug the battery when I want to turn the radio on and off. But you could use it if you want. So now it's time to just mount these components on the chassis. But before I do that, I'm going to lift the chassis up, bolt the seats back on, and you can see why I didn't have them on, because I wanted to flip it upside down. So I'll lift this up, bolt the seats on, Loctite this, and mount this back down. So I've got my deck back down, my seats on. The kit comes with some double sticky tape, a thin double sticky tape, and a padded double sticky tape. So I'm going to use a small piece, and it doesn't take much. This stuff is very sticky. Of double stick tape. And I will put it on the bottom of the speed control. And mount it down over here. And my battery lead, of course, will go right here to my battery. The speed control, or the receiver, I will put on this side. Same way. Got a piece of tape. Now, one thing that instructions show, I'll show you real quick here. Get this mounted down. Okay, and then I'll tie these up with some tie wraps. So the instructions show hooking the receiver antenna to this little bracket that they give you right here, and then later the instructions will show you actually running that up to an antenna that you attach to the top of the body. Now, for the old 75 megahertz radios that we used to use 20 years ago, that was how you did it. The new radios, these antennas do not need to be attached to anything else. I just use some black electrical tape, since it hides in the body, to tape them down. And it's best if they're not coiled up, and also best if they're not, say, laying right on top of the motor. But interference with these radios is generally not an issue. So I will just tape these down, and I'm going to tie up my wiring a little bit neater. So I've got my wiring tied up. Before I did that, I double checked to make sure that when I moved my stick forward, my axles were rotating forward, and they were. So the basic chassis is all done, ready to go. It shifts, it runs, looking good. I want to mention batteries real quickly. This is a LiPo battery, lithium polymer battery, and this is a nickel metal hydride battery. Now, I normally would always recommend a nickel metal hydride battery, especially for beginners. They're very safe. They're heavier. Now, the LiPo batteries in an airplane, the lightweight's an advantage, but in a truck, having it heavier is actually an advantage. I use them both, but these are easier to charge. They're less expensive to buy. This is a 3600 milliamp, which when this truck was designed, an 800 milliamp was the standard pack, and 1200 was the high capacity pack. So this battery has 3 times the capacity of the batteries available when this truck was designed. So capacity is not a problem. This truck will run for hours on this battery. Sometimes I use LiPo batteries like this one, which is a 2000, because it's very small and is an advantage in some of the trucks I build because of the small size. But with this truck, it's not an issue. The battery just goes into the battery tray like this, and these slide across here, and then they give you clips to hold the battery in place, and then it just plugs in. So that takes care of the battery. Now we can move forward to all the fun stuff, making the truck look good and run. The tires and wheels are pretty straightforward. The tires just stretch over the rim. And I like to work them around a little bit. You have to make sure they seat completely in the bead. Wiggle them a little bit like this, and that gets them nice and round. That's a front wheel right there. The rear wheels, there's an inner and an outer, and they just fit together like this and are held together with nuts that are captured on the back side here, and these little Allen head bolts. And normally, once these are put together, I use a little drop of thin super glue in a couple places to hold the tires on. I'm not going to glue these on because I have something special planned for this later in an upcoming video. So I'll go ahead and finish putting these all together. To prep the front and rear bumpers, you just snap in the lenses. The orange lenses on the rear bumper go out. Now, I normally would use a drop of my clear plastic cement, but I'm not going to on this because, again, I have something special planned for this bumper later. The bumpers are set up so you can install lights. We're not doing lights in this video, but I may do a future video on the lights. And then these covers just screw in place. And again, the lenses just snap in. So I'll go ahead and install these bumpers. They just simply screw onto the front and back, and then I'll put the tires and wheels on. Now the tires and wheels, the front tires use a bearing. Again, I'm using ball bearings. We use a bearing on the inside and the outside. They slide over the axle, and then a lug nut goes on. And holds those in place. On the rear wheels, they use this hex adapter. There's a hex on the inside of the tire that matches it, and this is splined so it fits over the shaft. The tire then slides over it, and the hex will drive it, and then a lug nut goes on to hold that on. So I'll mount the bumpers, I'll mount the tires and wheels, we'll see how it looks. Well, there's the chassis, all complete, ready to run, and tires and wheels on, bumpers are on. Got my radio here. Now, an important thing when you're running these is to always turn the transmitter on first and off last, because you don't want the truck on with no transmitter. It could take off. So I'll plug this in, and I'm going to put the back end up on a board here to hold it up off the bench. Our steering is working fine, and there's our throttle, so hold that. Second gear, third gear, second gear, first gear, reverse. I have the speed control set. Your speed control will come with instructions, but when I go forward, it won't go in reverse until I push it down once. And that's a safety feature, so you can't accidentally go from forward to reverse instantly, which is really hard on transmission gears. So I can set this down on the bench, and it should drive forward, backwards. You can see that that 55 turn motor gives me a really nice low end. Okay. Everything's working. Now it's time to start on the body, and we'll finish up that. So we're going to end part 2 here. As I mentioned earlier, my software wouldn't render all the parts I shot in one video, so I'm going to divide it into 2. Part 3 will be up immediately, so you can go right there. I am so thankful for all my subscribers, all the people that watch my videos. That 10,000 number still is very humbling. I have enjoyed getting to meet people all around the world. England, Australia, Germany, Japan, everywhere. It's just unbelievable. When I started this, I didn't know it was going to happen, but it's been a lot of fun. I love building Tamiya trucks. I love building Tamiya kits. I'm going to, in the future, do some more tanks. Remember, part 3 will be finishing this, but then part 4 will be all the hop-ups I can do for under $100. And I think you'll be pretty surprised by what I can do on this truck for under $100 to make it even cooler. So hop back in for part 3, subscribe to my videos, leave comments, leave thumbs up. Thanks again for watching.